Hi, my name is Zeb, and this is Duel of the Giants by Z-Man Games. And this is a 2 to 4 player tank warfare game set in 1943 in Russia, which features the German side and the Russian side. And the goal of the game, the Russians are attempting with numerical superiority and more maneuverable tanks to break through the German lines, while the Germans, with anti-tank mines, anti-tank guns, and then 2 very powerful tanks, are trying to stop them from breaking out. So the goal of the game is basically for the Germans to create a choke point and then the Russians to try to make a breakthrough. So the rules for this game, unlike most board games or most war games, it's actually a little simpler than you would initially expect, though the rule book is a little bit of a tome. So you have to be prepared for that when you go into this. Each game comes with a randomized amount of terrain that each player can set up, so pieces like this. And the terrain has a variety of different effects. Forests hide your units and make it more difficult for enemies to shoot at them. High ground, such as this, gives your units additional range to see other enemy units. And then there's the basic steppe, which Russian units can move across more maneuverably. Each unit has a certain number of markers that they're also using in-game. So the Russian player, rather than deploying all of his tanks out, has these little markers as indicated by the hammer and sickle with the star on it. Some of these are real tanks, so you would get 16 of these, and half of them will be tanks and half not. So the German player doesn't exactly know where the Russian can consolidate his forces and how they're going to be moving. Likewise, the German player has a certain number of anti-tank mines, such as these little markers, but some of them are not real, some of them are. Likewise, there's anti-tank guns. Some of them are bluff. Some are actually artillery pieces. So both sides are setting up in such a way they're trying to fool the other player into not realizing where they're going to go. So on a board like this, we have a variety of different units. These are the Russian tank markers. Some of them are real, and some of them are not. And units with a little wheel on them indicate it's the real tank. If there's nothing on the back, it's just a bluff marker. These are tank traps right here. These impede the Russian player's movement. The tank markers can move through them, but they move slower than an actual tank would, so they don't have any specific advantage that way. These are anti-tank mines. If the Russian player hits those, his tank is slowed for a couple of turns. These are the Soviet or the German artillery markers. Some of them are real, some of them are bluffs, such as that one. The German or the Russian player does not know which are which. The 2 tanks the German player starts with are out in play, and then there's the Stuka, which is the German dive bomber. This unit is used by the German player. He can fly along and reveal which of the tank markers are real and which ones are bluffs. So the way these units get revealed as to what they are, when they come within an enemy's line of sight, which is usually within 2 spaces. So if I had an artillery piece here and a Russian tank came here, I would be able to see what it is, whether it's a bluff or whether it's an actual tank. The plane can fly along and anything surrounding it gets revealed. It can also destroy 1 tank per game and then it is forced to land again. Vis-a-vis terrain, the terrain without hexes, it costs 1 movement point to move across, with the exception of with the T-34, if it's just moving across the steppe, it gets additional movement. The forest costs an additional point to move through and serves as camouflage, and the high ground gives additional range. And this is everything basically for the summer 1943 play. The game also comes with a deck of cards specifically for the German player. How movement works for the Tiger tanks is that the German player will in secret program his moves. The Russian player doesn't actually get to see them acted out until after he's moved. So you have 6 kinds: the stop, a reverse. There's actually built into the model a mechanic for pivoting the turret, so that determines line of sight, pivot it the other way, forward, and then a turn. So the German player will do 5 cards, less if his tank has been damaged, and those are his movements for the turn. So if I were to, let's say I wanted to move forward 3 times, as indicated by the 3 cards, turn my gun once, and then come to a stop, I would select them. Russian player would make his moves, and then on my turn I would reveal, so it would be forward, 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 turn and stop. So something like that, for example. And that would be a given move for a turn. There's a point counter here. The point counter, it exists in a kind of tug-of-war style. So as each player accumulates points, for example, destroying a T-34 tank, I believe, nets the German player 2 points, so he would move it this way. If a Russian tank gets through, gets past all the obstacles and makes it off the board, he gets 5 points. So then it would move 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. When you get to this marker, you get a medal. That basically just keeps track of how many tens of points you've scored. Although most games don't tend to run that high, the game ends when there are no Russian tanks left on the field, either because they've been destroyed or because they've managed to escape and break out, in effect. Each unit also has a little card indicating their strength. So each unit has a given firepower. So, for example, this German Tiger tank has a firepower of 5. And for every range that you shoot beyond the first, it diminishes by 1. So if my Tiger's here and I shoot, I don't know, let's say it's facing this way, and I shoot a unit over here, it has an effective range of, or firepower of 4. So what happens is shots become weaker over longer distances, and then every unit has a set armor value. It depends on which angle. So the Tiger has a set firepower of 4. In effect, that actually makes it almost invulnerable to the T-34, which is the Russian tank, as its firepower is only equal to 4 at a given max. So it's in the T-34's interest to try to flank the Tiger and get to one of its weak points. The artillery pieces likewise have set firepower and range values. And then the Tiger, it cannot be destroyed in the course of gameplay, but for every damage it takes beyond its armor value, it loses points. So if I were to get behind it and shoot it in the rear, it would lose, and I had 4 firepower, it'd lose 1 there, and then it would take 3 damage. This would cost it 2 movement points every turn. So as it gets more damaged, it moves slower and slower, and it's less responsive, which then more German or Russian tanks can be used to break out. And then the only other unit that regularly moves is the Stuka. The Stuka gets 5 movement a turn, and it can fly for 4 turns. After that, it has to land back on its airfield, which never moves, or it crashes and the German player loses points. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It can do that. And then this Russian tank marker will be revealed either as a bluff or as a real thing. To destroy a Russian tank, it must approach it from behind. So if if this turns out, for example, to be a tank, it would have to go like that and approach from behind in order to destroy it. So the game happens in 4 phases, and I'll play through what that will look like here. In phase A, the German player will program his movement. So you take the cards and you program them however you want it to happen. So let's say with this tank, for example, do that and that. You can program up to 5, but you don't have to program more than 5. You can program if you just want it to do 1 movement that turn. That's all it has to do. Then in phase B, the Russian player can move. Russian player can move 2 of the tank markers, which have 2 movement points, and any number of activated tanks. In addition, he can activate however many he wants, which isn't generally advisable because you want to keep the element of secrecy for as long as possible. The disadvantage of the tank markers is they move slower. So on my turn, for the tank markers, I'll go, which if that was real, see, as neither of these have been revealed yet, they can't activate each other, but if the German player were to activate that, he would be able to tell whether or not that's a tank marker. In this instance, now I move my tanks. He gets 3. He goes here. Because he has line of sight to that, he reveals it. There's nothing there. He knows it's a bluff. Then, after all the Russian player's movement has happened, then the German player's programmed moves go off. So with this guy, I programmed him to turn, like so, and then to stop. So he's facing that. Because he has the line of sight on it, when the time comes, combat can begin. Because combat occurs in phase D, it happens when 2 units have a line of sight on each, or 1 unit it has at least a line of sight on another unit. So in this instance, he gets +1 range because of the high ground, and he's pointing at this unit's side armor. So in consulting the cards here, you can see that the Panzer has 5 firepower, +1, so he's effectively shooting that with 5. The T-34 has 2 armor on its side. Because it exceeds, the T-34 is blown to pieces without even having a chance to return fire. If the T-34 had been facing the Panzer, they would return fire at the exact same time, but given the T-34 or the Tiger's high frontal armor, it wouldn't have been able to do enough damage to get through in the first place. It's incumbent, it's necessary that the Russian player flank as much as possible because he will always lose in a straight-up fight with the heavier tanks. And then, once Phase D is over, combat is resolved, and the game goes again. And it goes through another turn until all the Russian tanks have been destroyed or have escaped. And that's how a typical turn plays out. The game also comes with an option for a winter combat. This would take place in the winter of 1943, I think. So it plays much the same as the regular game with a couple of exceptions. You don't get quite as much cover in the forests. The T-34 tanks actually move better in the winter. This is to reflect the fact that Russian tanks were generally considered better than German tanks in winter, and the Tiger's firepower is reduced a little bit. So overall, the winter scenario really favors the Russian player as opposed to the German. One other thing that exists, there are snowdrifts placed randomly on the map. And in a snowdrift, a tank or an anti-tank gun is effectively invisible unless the Stuka were to fly over it. So in effect, you can put them there for 2 turns maximum to camouflage your units, and then after that they have to come out again. If they move, the snowdrift is destroyed. One other thing to mention, the artillery pieces can also be moved. The German player can angle them as they wish, so if T-34s are coming from this direction, I can point that way. It is possible with these tokens, you place them on one turn, and then the next turn you can move it up to 3 spaces, and then it's done. So it's possible to move around your anti-tank units. They're not very mobile, however. So you basically want to make sure you have them in good places before the combat begins, because you're not going to have many opportunities to move them around. If the Russian player decides to attack an anti-tank gun, he has 2 ways to do it. If I were here, if I wanted to, I could simply shoot at it, but there's also the possibility of actually physically driving over it. What happens there, if the unit hasn't been revealed, if it turns out to be real, he overruns it and destroys it and gets a point. If not, it's discarded. The unit cannot be facing the same way, however, our combat has to begin. That is the core of the gameplay. It's possible for 3 or 4 players to play this, although I found it most effective with 2. In a 3-player game, one player takes control of the German artillery and the other person works the tanks. And then in a 4-player game, you would just split up the control of the Russian side between 2 people. It's also possible to join multiple boards together to wage a truly enormous tank battle. I would love to see that done, although it might be tricky to get enough copies of the game together. In doing so, you can really wage some truly epic Russian-style tank battles. So I enjoyed this game. It plays a little differently than other war games I've gone into in the past. Most of them are several hours in length, and they're very rule-intensive. This game, it's true that the rule book is a little bit of a book itself. It takes a couple read-throughs, but that said, the rules are actually simpler than they look, and it's fairly easy to grasp. Once you have it down, this can probably play in about half an hour, 45 minutes, if both players know what they're doing. And it's very replayable because the way the terrain gets randomized and the way each player bluffs the setup, it'll be set up such that no 2 games should ever be too similar. And players should have a good time in reading each other. I have a few tiny quibbles with the game. For one thing, just the packaging. It's kind of difficult to put all of this away. There are a lot of elements that go together, and the pieces are a little fragile. One of the testers had hoped that this turret on this Russian tank would be movable. It is, but he tried moving it by the barrel, and the barrel has snapped off. So it looks kind of like a crippled tank. This piece on this stand, the stand does not seem to be detachable, and it doesn't really fit very easily in the box. I'm convinced it's going to break off at some point. So I would modify that. But those are tiny things. You could get your own carrying case or improvise it somehow. I'm sure it could be set up so it wouldn't be too problematic. It's a fun game. It's pretty quick to master, but there's a lot of strategy that can go into it, so I would recommend it, especially if you're a wargaming or a tank battle aficionado. This could be a very fun game. And if I had to rank this game, I'd put it an 8 out of 10. It's a little expensive, and it's not necessarily going to cater to everybody. I think it does work best as a 2-player game, but it's fun, and it's got a lot of depth to it. A lot of depth that I didn't necessarily expect. There's a lot of unusual strategy that goes into it. So kudos to Z-Man Games for coming up with another innovative concept.